All right, hello everybody, and thank you for coming to our panel on working with allies and partners. I think we have the panel that has traveled the greatest distance to be here, so we appreciate that. We're fortunate to have the Honorable John Rood, Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, the Honorable Ng Heng Hen, Dr. Ng, Minister of Defense from Singapore, his counterpart from Sweden, the Honorable Peter Hultqvist, and Michelle Flournoy, also honorable, who was in the same position a few years ago. So we have some good symmetry here on a very important topic. So let me start with you, John, if I could. You testified this week at the House Armed Services Committee, I think, and in your prepared testimony, you talked about alliances. You said, building a constellation of strong allies is a foundational pillar of the strategy. Maybe start there. Why is that so, and in what way will this constellation look different than the past alliance structures we've known over previous decades?
Well, first of all, it's great to be here at the Reagan Library again and get a little bit of the infusion of goodwill that President Reagan had, including for this topic. As we talk about the role of friends and allies in our national defense strategy as we look forward, one of the things that you start with is just how dynamic that national security environment is that we're in, and the scale of the challenge to the values-based, international rules-based order that we've put in place so carefully over the past few decades. Ronald Reagan had a saying where he's well quoted talking about the fact that freedom doesn't pass to the next generation through the bloodstream. Our children don't grow up with this in there, and for every generation of Americans, there's an obligation, along with our partners around the world who are like-minded, to preserve that freedom, to do what is required to defend it. And so when we look at the global security environment and the challenge posed by Russia and its attempts to exercise a veto and to violate the sovereignty of its neighbors, about China establishing a vision for an authoritarian-based system, we have to ask ourselves, how are we going to be successful in confronting these dangers? And that's where the second line of effort in our national defense strategy talks about the fact friends and allies have to be there with you. And for the United States, a core competency of ours has been building enduring alliance-based structures. It's something which allowed us to win the Cold War and has set us apart since that time. And I think that's just more critical than ever. And it begins with, do you have a shared outlook on the world? Do you have a shared outlook and vision for our values? And can you go about things where you have common interests in a way that is productive and respects the sovereignty of our partners, but also, over time, develops a closeness of relationships? And I'm happy to talk about more in the Q&A, a number of the areas where I think we can say we're making progress in that area, but it is definitely a challenge. And it's a challenge because we have large competitors here. We've reemerged into great power competition with a different vision of the world, and they're also using a set of tactics that are tough to counter.
Minister, how does it look to you?
I'll speak from Singapore's perspective. It's a small country and what used to be a difficult neighborhood in ASEAN, if you remember the 60s to the 80s. But if I can put some context to that partnership which we have in the US, 2 months ago I was with my Prime Minister and we had traveled to New York on the sidelines of the United Nations. And Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, signed a renewal of a memorandum of understanding with President Trump. And there is a context to this MOU. In my mind, in Singapore's perspective, it was another historic moment. And I say another historic moment because the original MOU was signed in 1990. And for those of you who remembered history, it was at a time which the US had lost its access to Clark and Subic. And Singapore then stepped forward and said we would offer, we're a small place, but we would offer access to US military planes and ships through our military bases. Mr. Lee Kuan Yew signed that agreement, the original MOU, with then was Vice President Quayle. And when Mr. Lee was asked why we did that, I want to quote for him because I think this quote is as relevant today as it was then. Mr. Lee said, quote, "America's presence, in my view, is essential for the continuation of international law and order in East Asia." Remember, this is 1990. "An Asia in which cooperation and competition increases everyone's well-being peacefully and without recourse to arms has been the norm. This kind of Asia, this kind of Pacific, cannot exist without America being a major economic and security presence," unquote. The renewal of the MOU, I said, was historic because it reaffirms our position on the US in our region, which has changed considerably since the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. And today, because of the 1990 MOU, the US is the largest user, the military is the largest user of our air base and naval bases. And in reciprocity, the US has allowed us to train in the US, and on any given year, we have more than 1,000 fighters, pilots, gunners, infantrymen. I don't think there's any other country, big or small, that has a kind of footprint in the US. And we're very thankful for these training opportunities. Yesterday, I signed an MOU with Secretary Asper, which allows us or provides access to another fighter squadron in Guam. So we're thankful for that. And I think these two MOUs exemplify our position vis-a-vis the US presence in our region, and I think also sets the trajectory in which Singapore sees itself in partnership with the US for the region.
Peter, you're from a country that has charted its own course, now arguably a more dangerous part of the world than we thought it might be 15 or 20 years ago. How does this question of alliances look to you?
Thank you so much for the invitation and the possibility to be here at Reagan National Library and this important conference. I really value that. We took a decision in the Swedish Parliament in May 2015 to build the Swedish security policy, defense policy, from two pillars. Number one, upgrading national defense capabilities. Number two, cooperate with friends and partners in a deeper way. We saw these two decisions as a key factor for be a partner in a security network that can build stability in our part of Europe, Scandinavia. Together with Finland, very deep cooperation, together with the Baltic states, together with Norway, together with Denmark, Great Britain, Poland, Germany, France, but also a strong transatlantic link to United States and Canada. We see the transatlantic link as a key factor to make stability because we need very high level of strength. And when we exercise together, when we create interoperability together, when we do things together, it's a security signal to the Russians. The environment is that we had aggression against Georgia 2008. We have two parts of Georgia that are now occupied by Russia, Abkhazia or South Ossetia. That's realities. We have annexation of Crimea 2014. We have ongoing war in Ukraine. And we have an upbuild of military capability on the Russian side that have been consequent now for many, many years. And the equipment they buy today, they can use for 20, 25 years in the future. So they will be a factor that we must see that this is existing and it's a long-term problem. So we need unity, we need balance, we need the European Union sanctions. We need to keep together as democratic, free states, open societies, but we need also to challenge what we see about disinformation, deterioration, undermining of our systems, all these attacks on a daily, weekly, monthly basis that we can recognize, and that is also a factor that we have to handle. So I see a new security environment that has been worse, that we must do things together to stand up, to create a higher threshold and stability so we can have peace in the long run. From time to time, we also have provocative behavior in the air and on the sea. And we have tests of our systems from their side. So a new situation creates also a new policy, and we have started 2015, and we will make a new defense decision next year, and we will invest more money in upgrading military capability, and I think also we will have a broad majority in the parliament to deepening the cooperation in the NATO partnership with the United States, with the Nordic countries, and with our other friends and allies in Europe.
Thank you. Michelle.
So it's great to be back at the Reagan Forum and talking about alliances and partnerships. I think, you know, as John mentioned, the focus of the National Defense Strategy on this issue is absolutely correct. It's an incredible priority for any strategy that's going to work, but it's also a source of tremendous historical, current, and future comparative advantage for the United States, particularly vis-a-vis Russia and China. But it's a very hard area to evaluate because I think there's a real dichotomy between the state of our alliances at the defense, military to military or Defense Department to ministry level, and the state of our alliances at the strategic level of the United States and how the United States is perceived in the world. So if you look just at the defense level, there's a lot of good news. You know, when you look at what we've done with NATO, this, you know, the funding for the European Defense Initiative is more than doubled. The creation of this NATO Readiness Initiative that we heard about from Secretary Esper is extremely important. The increased rotation of US troops into Central and Eastern Europe to reassure our partners in the Baltics and in Poland and Hungary and other frontline states. This is all extremely good news in Europe. If you look at the Indo-Pacific, we have a very strong strategy. We have a new maritime security initiative. We have increased freedom of navigation. We have really serious efforts to deepen our ties with countries like Vietnam and India. All of that is very good news. But if you pull back and you look at the strategic level of US policy and the unorthodox and unpredictable way in which this administration, and particularly this White House, has conducted foreign policy, then it's a different picture. In that picture, you have allies and partners who've watched us pull out of a number of treaties. The Iran deal, the Paris Climate Accord, the TPP negotiations. You have had the United States, the only country that's ever had Article 5 invoked by NATO for the United States after 9/11, seeming to be hesitant to reaffirm our commitment to collective defense in NATO. You have the abrupt abandonment of a battlefield ally in the Kurds on the ground in Syria, which doesn't just affect the Kurds. Every ally and partner we have around the world looks at that and wonders, what would happen to me? And finally, you have, not finally, but another thing on the list is, I think, you know, in the face of the Iranian provocations, first attacks on tankers, then a shoot down of a drone, then the very audacious attack on Saudi oil infrastructure, and no real response other than some additional troops being flowed to the region. When I travel in the region, I hear have people question, where's deterrence, where is reassurance? So if you look at that more strategic level, then it's a much more concerning picture, because you have a situation where there's a perception, right or wrong, but there's a perception of US retreat, particularly in the Middle East. There's a perception of unpredictability, and what worries me most is unreliability. And if that becomes the prevailing view, at the strategic level, then you're going to have adversaries who keep testing to find out where are the lines if they're not clear. When will the United States actually respond, which sets us up for miscalculation and escalation of crises. And you'll have allies who feel they have to hedge. If I can't count on the United States, I've got to take care of my security by turning elsewhere. So that's what worries me. If we're not clear about what we stand for, countries will not be sure that we will stand with them.
So I want to follow up on that. First, let me just say we're going to take questions from people who are here and watching. You can submit them on the app or on Twitter at #RNDF. So we will come to that toward the end. Let me ask our foreign guests to pick up on what Michelle just said. This idea that the uncertainty and unpredictability at the top of the administration is causing allies and partners to wonder whether the U.S. will be there in time of need, even as people like Secretary Rood are, and even at a higher level, the agreements you're signing continue, and so that there's this kind of dichotomy. And I wonder if you see this in your region, if not in your own country, among the people around you, and what impact it's having. Maybe start with you, Dr.
Well, let's start with the military presence, whether that's been uncertain, and the answer to that is no. In fact, that's been a step up, and that's looking from our part of the world, and I'm conscious that the so-called pivot to our region must have meant a decline in other areas. But from our point of view, across various secretaries of defense, each secretary that has come by and announced a number of measures at the Shangri-La Dialogue, it's been a step up. Whether it was in terms of number of Navy boats, whether it was in terms of upgrading the generalship of the PACAF, the Army, as well as the Air Force. As well as these agreements, and we've just heard Secretary Asper say during the afternoon session that he sees the Asia-Pacific region, the Indo-Pacific region, as the theater going forward. So from the military presence, it's not. From the economic and trading systems, obviously there has been. Globalization 1.0, if you put it simply, America and its Western allies were seen as the prime architects, whether it was WTO, GATT, the international financial trading systems. And it was a bit surreal in one of two Davoses ago where the WEF held its meeting, and to hear the American administration push a certain line and President Xi Jinping stating certain views. And if you had swapped speeches some years back, you would have thought that the Chinese side was articulating what the US had said and the other side, vice versa. Mm-hmm. So the trading system, there are new rules, obviously. There have been people who have benefited more, and we accept US's view that it's been unfairly implemented. From the philosophical view, in terms of America's value system, what it espouses to export and what it bases its foreign policy on, yes, but I think ASEAN members recognize that America is also responding to its own internal politics. Is US the sole cause of this shift? Probably not. You are responding to the circumstances, so I'm giving our view from Singapore, and I presume I speak for some of the general aspects for ASEAN member states.
Mm-hmm. Just on a similar, just to take it one step, there was just a NATO meeting, which by many reports was quite successful, and I hope we can come back to that. But it was accompanied by President Trump saying, we get the least good out of NATO. It helps France the most, it helps us the least. And it's obviously not the first time he has made that kind of remark. How does that play in Europe? Does it have an effect, or do people shrug it off? How do you see this dichotomy that Michelle was talking about?
We see a lot of debates, a lot of speculations, about a lot of analysis in the public arena today. But when I got the question about our agreements and what we do together with the United States, I say that we have a statement of intent with the United States, and we have a trilateral statement of intent, Sweden, Finland, and United States. And this is about exercises, interoperability, material, international operations, research, and sharing of information. And I can see that everything we agree upon, it's also delivered. And I also see that the United States deliver a lot to Europe today with military resources. So that is also a reality we must also talk about at the same time as we talk about Twitter and speculate about different sort of things. So I can only see here the result. And from my point of view as defense minister, and I've been in all this process with statements of intents and deepening of cooperation now for more than 5 years. And I can see that we have an excellent relationship with Pentagon, with armed forces in the United States. And another thing that's very important is, if I say BALTOPS, Baltic Protector, Trident Juncture, Cold Response, Northern Wind, Arctic Challenge exercises, this is exercises we are doing together. Together, different countries and the United States is also involved. And what we are doing when we are doing this is to balancing the situation in our part of Europe. We build stability together, and in the long run also peace. In Aurora 17, for example, it was a big exercise in Sweden with 20,000 soldiers. We have participation from the US side. Next year we'll have a total defense exercise called Aurora 2020, and we will also there have US presence. So this is also realities, and we must value that. About the values, I think it's very important that we see this very clear now. We have authoritarian societies like China, like Russia. They are ready to use military power for fulfilling of military goals. But we also in Europe, in different countries, and also in the United States, have tendencies with people, with forces that more and more orientate and support authoritarian ideas. And that we also have to fight against inside our own societies, so we can keep up with this open democracy and openness that we have fought for so many years. The reason why World War II was a fight between different ways of see how people should live. So we must, in our new world that we are living in today, have the same value-based view when we are tackling this. So I think that from our position in today, it's very natural to cooperate with other states with the same sort of values. And I think we also create more of stability in that way. And accept everything with Twitter and reporting from different conferences, I see deliverances, and that is very important for the realities in our environment.
At the NATO meeting, one of the things agreed on was that China would be on NATO's agenda. I'm going to come to you on this too, but what does that mean? What role should NATO, is NATO going to help defend the United States against China? What does it mean?
Well, just to pick up on this last part of the conversation and respond a little bit, as well as then to come into the China question, I think when you look at your alliance relationships at the strategic level with other countries, the way I kind of break that down are you seeing the world similarly in that the largest challenges to your way of life, to your security, to the economic well-being of your citizens, are you seeing those similarly? And that's the area where I think the NATO, recent NATO leaders meeting is very noteworthy. There's the traditional concern about Russia, and that is not diminishing in terms of Russia's threat and the potential for malign activities by Russia, violating the sovereignty of others, use of violence against others, and willingness to use force. So you saw that at NATO. You also saw then the beginning of a real deeper discussion about China. And what you've seen over the last year to 18 months within the halls of NATO is an increasing debate about the degree to which China's activities, and they're very integrated, as you know, military activities, economic activities, societal activities. What is the One Belt, One Road, which President Xi also points out has a security dimension to it, efforts to exercise soft power by the Chinese. So what you saw at NATO is a common recognition that this is a shared concern of a security alliance, that's something that can affect all member states. And then we've got to tackle it in certain areas like 5G and telecommunications, where China is sort of systematically targeting certain sectors of society or the economy where they want to, one, enjoy a technological edge on others, but they want to use it in a way that will advance a different world vision, and to see China not only advance economically, but indeed in terms of its place in setting the standards for the world, promoting an authoritarian vision, and also taking advantage of it for security purposes. So you'll see the alliance cooperate there. But just to respond to a few of the other things mentioned, when I look at the health of the alliance, are you seeing the world similar in what you're trying to protect with your values and the type of trends you're trying to deal with? Check. I think NATO is meeting that standard. Secondly, are you taking real steps to do that? And I think the steps on spending are one of the ways that you can measure that's objective. You saw this last year, another 4.6% growth in real terms in spending by NATO countries for the 5th consecutive year, growth in spending at NATO. Since 2016, when President Trump took office, $130 billion of additional spending by NATO allies. And most importantly, when President Obama served, the allies agreed at Wales to a pledge by 2024 to be at 2% of GDP, and perhaps more importantly, to spend 20% of their defense budgets on procurement. So where do we stand with that? In terms of the NATO Secretary General's projection in 2024, the alliance will spend $400 billion more on defense spending, non-US defense spending. And with respect to the 20% number, you now have 27 nations projected to be at that 20% of their procurement spend, of their defense spending, devoted to procurement of new capabilities. And I think in other areas that say, are we seeing things similar as an alliance, and are we willing to commit our young men and women to harm's way? Over the last 2 years, NATO countries are deploying more forces with the United States outside of NATO's area of operations, whether that's in Iraq or in Afghanistan, you name it. That's another area that, again, is an objective measure of merit. In Afghanistan alone, about 8,700 troops from NATO allies there doing train, advise, assist for the Afghan forces. Very important. Another perhaps less hard-edged metric would be, can you muster forces to go do the kinds of training and exercises together? Last year, we did Trident Juncture in and around Iceland and other areas. Really got the Russians' attention because it was a dynamic force employment. Over 50,000 forces from NATO nations participating. What we have planned for next year is one called Defender 2020. We'll take a full United States Army division, pick them up, move them to Europe, deploy them across to the various countries, and we'll be joined by a number of other countries. So there'll be 37,000 plus NATO forces that will commit to this exercise to show in large scale our ability to have speed of assembly, speed of maneuver, and to mass force where we need to together. So there are a number of metrics like that that I look at, and I take Michelle's point that there are more things than just some of these military metrics to measuring a relationship to include trade. But in the hardcore security area, where you're really going to go do things like confront shared challenges by deploying forces together, I think you can point to a number of metrics that show the trend line is positive, not uniformly positive. Mm-hmm. We most certainly have our challenges, such as in a place like Turkey, but the general trend line is positive.
I guess what some people find disorienting is when you talk about values, that these things are all going on this level in support of a worldview, but the president doesn't talk about the values, and in fact often seems more comfortable with authoritarian leaders than with democratic leaders, with Erdogan, with Putin, and so I don't know if you want to go any further, or should we move on?
Well, simply to say, this is, if you look at the national security strategy released by President Trump
Yes.
in his first major national security address, you'll find this spoken to. If you look at the national defense strategy, you will find this. All of the things that are reflective of the administration's policies, I think you'll find this thread throughout, and a desire to protect this rules-based order that has been so important to our prosperity. But I think the genius of it, it's fostered prosperity for so many around the world. It is not something that is uniquely for the benefit of the United States. And you will see, China is pursuing a different approach with things like One Belt, One Road, and I think over time, I like our odds of success better than theirs.
Dr. Ng, do you think the strategy that recognized China as the major adversary, was that the right thing to do? Was it welcomed in the region?
Well, you're the United States, so I won't comment on your strategy, which, well, for all intents and purposes will be what you're acting on. But let me just comment on what Michelle was saying. And we are really talking about American soft power and foreign policy at its nub. What it's trying to direct at, what it's trying to conceive, or what it's trying to bring its partners toward. And context is important because soft power and image is defined not only by your own aspirations, but what the context is, and sometimes by your adversaries and antagonists. So if you take, again from ASEAN's perspective, the 1960s where decolonization took place, we gained our independence in 1965. It wasn't so long ago that we did. In fact, Brunei was the last country of the 10 that gained its independence. That was in 1984. In that context, the American soft power, if I characterize it with President Kennedy's speech, inaugural speech, where he made a pledge and he said that one form of colonial control should not have merely passed away to be replaced by another more iron tyranny. That captured the zeitgeist of the moment. These were newly independent states wanting to participate in the global economy, which they were excluded from. They were colonized. The rules of international trading were put in place by America and its Western liberal allies, and the sum of its parts was greater than the whole. The general economy was lifted, and ASEAN today is 640 million, 2.8 trillion US dollars, equivalent to the size of UK. It's a remarkable achievement by any record based on American foreign policy, past policy. It worked. Is the context the same as today? Can you shape China as similar to the communist threat in the 60s and the 70s? Yes and no. There are certain aspects. But consider this, in the last 2 decades, and remember in the 80s and 1990s, even in the early 2000s, the American economy wasn't doing so well, neither was the EU. It was the Chinese economy that kept Asia afloat. So from ASEAN member states' perspective, you could say that they want the best of all worlds. Their economic engines are dependent on the US, the China, and the EU. China is now the largest trading partner of all the countries in ASEAN, and also including Australia and New Zealand. I think that's a significant change from the 60s and 70s. And whatever strategy America wants to define its core policy or foreign policy, whether it's soft power or foreign policy, has to take that into account.
Mm-hmm. Michelle, let me put you on the spot a little bit, since we put John on the spot. This morning there was talk in the opening panel, you may have heard, about the dangers of isolationism in both parties. And the alliances we're talking about, I think all of you would agree, depend on US leadership and forward engagement. We have a field of Democratic candidates who I think are all talking about ending endless wars, as they call it, bringing troops home, is that consistent with your vision of alliances, and where do you think the party is headed on U.S. leadership?
I actually think we're at a moment where I think the far right and the far left on our political spectrum both have pretty strong isolationist tendencies. Some of that is in direct response to the Iraq and Afghanistan wars and the high cost and the length of time and duration and so forth. But if you actually poll Americans, if you look at the polling of Americans on foreign policy, you get pretty consistent and somewhat different picture, which is Americans understand that we can't retreat from the world, that to safeguard our own security and prosperity, we have to be engaged. They want America to be engaged. They want us to use our leadership to defend the rules-based order. They want to see, they understand that allies and partners are a critical advantage. And so the polling presents a very different picture. I do think there's a challenge of taking what has been a very sort of Washington elite conversation about the renewed great power competition period, and taking that out to the United States and having a broader discussion about this period of competition. We have really promising chapters in our history that repeatedly show that when Americans are asked to compete, we do really, really well. When we have leadership, when we have vision, when President Kennedy says we're going to the moon, and why? I mean, the country responds. So I think if you were to have that kind of leadership, that kind of vision, and an administration and a president that would actually say the number one thing we need to do for our own competitiveness is to invest in the drivers here at home, whether it's research and development, STEM, education, smart immigration policy, 21st century infrastructure, our alliances. And the last point I'll make is, I think, an opportunity and a challenge to going forward with our alliances and our partners is how do we go on the journey together in this time of technology disruption. So the United States military over the next 10 years is going to fundamentally change how it fights. And we're going to be using technologies, that Secretary Esper talked about, AI, autonomy, robotics, hypersonics, space and cyber as warfighting domains, all of this. If we're not careful to really bring our allies and partners with us on that journey, we will lose the interoperability that all of these exercises and all of this investment and all of this hard work for so many administrations has created. And so we've got to get very concrete. We need to bring those allies and partners into the concept development, the war gaming, the experimentation. They should be sitting in our innovation hubs with us. We should be doing joint research and development where we can. And we need to be much more strategic in thinking through the tech transfer, the security cooperation policies, and so forth. Because ultimately, the real recipe for success in this authoritarian democracy tension is we want a community of democracies, free democracies that are pooling their resources to defend against the authoritarian trends in the world.
We have one slide that let's put up because it's very apt to what you were just saying, that the U.S., the American public does support alliances, but also thinks they should do more. That's kind of okay, it's time to take questions.
I can
unscreened and
can
sure. If we keep it brief, because I promised we'd take a couple from the.
Yeah, only short. I think isolation is a solution of nothing. It will not solve any problem, and I think we should be very clear about that, because the world is today so integrated. And if we want to live life as free nation and democratic nations, we cannot isolate each other, because then the authoritarian societies and authoritarian states will be stronger and can maneuver on the international arena on a broader space with no position. We must see the challenge and we must do it together, so many countries as possible, and we must connect what we are doing all the time to international rules and regulations that we have agreed upon, because that is the only roadmap we have if we want to have some sort of society in a human way. So isolation is no solution of anything.
Okay, let's try and get a couple of these in, because of course the audience had better questions than I do. Mr. Ruud, at the NATO meeting in London, President Macron seemed to insist that terrorism was the #1 threat. This is at odds with the national defense strategy. How do we come together with France and other allies on this basic assessment?
Well, I think one of the areas that highlights some divergence in is that our view is terrorism most assuredly is a major threat. And as we speak now, our forces are in the field in the fight against ISIS and the fight against Al-Qaeda. I think one of the amazing things from the time I last served in government roughly 10 years ago, and when I came back to the Trump administration, every morning I come in to report after report where our forces are busy all night in this amazing activity of counterterrorism cooperation activities. And so when I sort of read the roll-ups or the statistics, what used to be an unusual event to conduct 1, 2, 3, 4, 10 strikes in an evening, this amazing machine that is now the United States military that before did these as one-off is just chunk, 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 spinning these things out every night with amazing rapidity, amazing precision, and amazing success. And to wit, the Baghdadi raid is a remarkable accomplishment for a military. I don't know, I bet I wouldn't find it in the Post many days in its news coverage after that, because this has become such a rapid activity. But the distinction we drew in the national defense strategy is that terrorism and the fight against it is not the preeminent threat of our time. It does not have the greatest potential to transform America's way of life and that of our friends and allies in the same way that this ideological competition with the great powers does. That in that way, that poses an existential threat to not only ourselves again, but to the Western-leaning countries in the world in this system that we've put forward. So we do a lot of counterterrorism work with the French. We support them in places like the Sahel in Africa. They also work with us in quite a few other locations around the world. So it's not to say when you talk counterterrorism, there's a substantial divergence. But I think particularly on the threat posed by Russia and China, at least President Macron's view and that of some of his cabinet is different in terms of it and not being seen as large a threat in the way that we do. And indeed, I think a number of our allies see it.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So then one more to the defense ministers. What effect is our domestic political conversation about U.S. bases abroad? And there I'd include the recent talks in South Korea, which seem to have suspended without any happy resolution. What effect is that conversation having on the allies that host our military and others in those regions?
Well, if you took a straw poll of both leaders and the people in ASEAN, and I speak on ASEAN so to contextualize our response, I think most would say that they want it to be continued. America's presence, they don't want to choose between the great power rivalry between US and China, but they also both want to be involved, including other powers. Do we recognize that America's domestic politics is not business as usual? It's hard not to notice. Do we adjust to that? Yes. Do we want assuredness that in the main American foreign policy is still inclusive, multilateral, and progressive? I think certainly yes, and we believe it to be so.
Discussions in United States always popping up in some way in Europe, and there will be more in essence speculation about what is the meaning behind this and what can it lead to. But we can also see deliverances now to Poland with with new establishments that the United States make, and we can also see more of U.S. presence directly in the Baltics, and we can see also deliverances of different sort of resources. So I said some things about that before here, but this is also a reality. But I think it's necessary with U.S. presence in different parts of the world, because that creates also stability in the long run. This is a very complex game to handle all these security challenges. So if you withdraw, that have a direct impact and direct effect. There is very important with leadership in these sort of questions, and in the end of every discussion, it will be about what sort of world do we want to have? Do we want to have a rule-based order? Do we want to have open societies, or will we open up the doors for something else that we don't want to have? So that is the key question in the end of the day. And I think that we must take some sort of responsibility for that together. And United States is a strong force, very strong force, and have a responsibility for leadership here. But we must also do what we can from the other countries.
Well, thank you. I see we're down to 0 seconds. I think the minister's comment that our politics are at an unusual time and it's difficult not to notice could be an epitaph for our age. But I think we also saw a lot of convergence here on the values and the importance of alliances. So please join me in thanking a great panel.